So, picture this. A waitress, not exactly living the high life, spots a billionaire wearing a ring that's a dead ringer for her mom's. At first, she figures it's just one of those things, right? But then she mentions her mom's name, and the guy just freezes up. Now, what kind of secret's this dude carrying around? What's the real story behind that ring? Stick around, and we'll get to the bottom of this heartwarming tale. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, will ya? Now, Maple Hollow, Vermont, wasn't asking for much. It was one of those towns where everyone knew your business, but nobody really talked about what was eating them up inside. Inside this fancy restaurant, the Velvet Antler, things were pretty cozy. Glasses clinking, polite laughter hanging in the air. The well-to-do folks talked low and tipped big. They never paid much mind to the waitress, Rachel Lane, shuffling around in her worn-out black shoes. But Rachel wasn't looking to get noticed. Not anymore. At 24, she'd already had to ditch the kind of life most girls her age were still chasing after. College, traveling, nights out with friends. All that went out the window the day her mom's cough turned into something serious. Now, her world was smaller, colder, more focused. She worked her tail off, paid the bills, and just prayed her mom, Margaret, had some time left. Then, this guy walks in. The front door chimes softly, and he comes in alone. No coat flapping in the breeze. No phone glued to his hand. Just a tall fella in a sharp-looking gray overcoat, with a bit of silver in his hair and an air of quiet around him like he was wearing it. He didn't start looking around for someone or pause to take in the room. He just stood still for a second, then headed over to the host stand with a presence that just made people turn and look. Rachel was too far away to hear what he said, but she did see the manager stand up a little straighter, and the hostess flashed a wider smile. They led him to a corner table by the window, the best seat in the house. Snow was falling real gentle outside the glass, right in Rachel's section. She straightened out her apron, grabbed her notepad, and headed over. No jitters, just plain tired and a practiced smile plastered on her face. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to the Velvet Antler. Can I get you something to drink to start?" He looked up, and his eyes were gray and watchful, like they were always looking for something. He didn't say anything for a second. Then he spoke in a calm, careful voice. "Dry martini," he said, "and whatever the chef recommends tonight." Rachel nodded and started to write it down, but then something caught her eye as he adjusted his silverware. A flash of light. She glanced over and saw it. A silver ring, nothing flashy, but solid. The metal clean, but looked kind of worn. It had a swirl engraved on it, so subtle you'd miss it if you weren't looking for it. Rachel's stomach did a little flip, and she didn't know why. She'd seen that design before, not in any stores or catalogs, not even on another person. She'd only seen it once years ago, tucked away in her mom's drawer, on a ring hidden under some old papers and photos. A ring Margaret never wore, never talked about. Rachel blinked, and everything felt like it was in slow motion. It couldn't be the same one, could it? There had to be 100 rings like that floating around, she thought. Still, just looking at him again, her chest tightened up. "Nice piece," she said, trying to keep it casual. "My mom has one that looks just like it." The guy didn't seem surprised, but his eyes did stay on her a little longer this time. "Does she?" he asked, not like he was dismissing her, not like he was amused, just quiet. Rachel hesitated, then went on. "She keeps it in a box, never wears it. Her name's Margaret. Margaret Lane." And just like that, the quiet changed. His face didn't exactly show it, but something flickered behind his eyes, a little twitch of his jaw, a quick hitch in his breath. His fingers, resting on the table, went still. Then he answered, real slow and careful. "That's a lovely name." He didn't ask anything else, didn't even smile. Just lowered his eyes, thanked her quietly, and shut down. Rachel walked away, but kept sneaking glances back at him. Something about him just rubbed her the wrong way. The way he looked at her after she said her mom's name, the way that ring looked way too familiar to ignore. And when he left real quiet, leaving a decent tip but skipping dessert, Rachel stood behind the counter, trying to get her breathing back to normal. She didn't know who he was, but something deep down told her he wasn't just some random stranger. Rachel hardly said a word for the rest of her shift. She just went from table to table, smiling at folks she couldn't hear, and scribbling down orders she couldn't even remember. Her body was there in the velvet antler, but her head was already out the door with him. That silver ring, that reaction to her mom's name, it shouldn't have meant anything, but somehow it did. When her shift finally ended just after midnight, she stepped out into the freezing cold, pulling her coat tight as she walked through the snow-covered streets of Maple Hollow. The wind stung her face, but she barely felt it. Her thoughts were way louder than the weather. She got home to the sound of, well, nothing. The house was always quiet these days. Her mom slept more now, her breathing shallow but steady. Rachel kicked off her shoes and walked down the hallway, stopping outside her mom's bedroom door. Margaret was curled up under a thin blanket, her hand resting on her chest, with a pill bottle sitting nearby. Seeing that broke Rachel's heart a little more every night, but she was breathing. That was enough for now. Rachel tiptoed across the room and reached for the old wooden drawer next to the bed. She opened it real slow. A hairbrush, a nearly empty bottle of cough syrup, a faded photo of her as a little kid, clinging to Margaret's leg. And then the box. Small. Velvet. No label. She'd seen it before. Years ago. Back when she used to snoop around for birthday cards or spare change. Margaret always snatched it back before she could ask any questions. Rachel sat on the edge of the bed and opened it. There it was. The ring. A dead ringer. Silver. The swirling pattern etched so gently into the band, it looked like it was moving. Her chest tightened up. She held it up to the soft light from a hallway. This wasn't just some coincidence. No way. It was the same ring. The same one the guy was wearing. She turned the ring over and over in her fingers, like it might just whisper its whole story to her if she listened close enough. But it didn't. It just sat there, quiet as a mouse, heavy in her hand. But something about it felt familiar. Rachel swallowed hard and looked over at her mom. Margaret didn't even twitch. Still, Rachel whispered, "Who was he?" But Margaret wasn't talking. Not yet, anyway. And Rachel wasn't even sure she wanted to know the answer. Morning came in real quiet. Gray skies. Snow piled up thick on the windowsill. One of those still mornings that made Rachel feel like the whole world was holding its breath. Margaret only stirred once when Rachel brought her some tea. The fever had backed off some, but she was still weak as a kitten. She was awake, more or less, just distant. Rachel didn't bring up the ring. Not yet. She kept looking at it, sitting on the kitchen table next to a stack of bills they couldn't afford to pay. It almost looked out of place. It was too shiny, too personal, too full of things they weren't saying. She sat there with it in her hand long after her mom had drifted back off to sleep. And that's when someone knocked. Sharp, careful, not frantic, not like they weren't sure they should be there. Just like they meant to be there. Rachel stood up slow. Her pulse started racing, even though she didn't know why. She peeked through the peephole and froze. It was him, the guy from the velvet antler, standing on their porch in a black wool coat, snow piling up on his shoulders, staring straight ahead. He didn't bring any flowers, no briefcase, no fancy car sitting out front. Just him. Rachel's hands were shaking a little as she opened the door. "You," she whispered. "How'd you find us?" He didn't even blink. "I asked your name," he said, real gentle. "I've got people who can find things." Rachel's first thought was to slam the door in his face, but something in his voice stopped her. Not just confidence, not trying to charm her, something else. "Wait." He looked down for a second, like he was trying to figure out the right words to say. "My name is Jonathan Pierce," he said, "and I think I made a mistake a long, long time ago." Rachel just stared at him, her mouth hanging open a little. That name, Pierce. She knew that name. The tech giant. Always on those lists, the richest people in the world. All those buildings and college campuses named after him. He wasn't just some rich guy. He was that rich. And he was standing on their beat-up porch in shoes that looked like they'd seen better days, with dirt all over them. Rachel could barely whisper, "Why?" Jonathan looked her in the eye. "Because I think I made a mistake a very long time ago." She hesitated, then stepped aside, letting him in. Inside, The living room suddenly felt way too small. The couch too old and worn. The air too thin. Margaret was propped up on some pillows in bed, blinking slow as Rachel walked in. "Mom," she said softly, "there's someone here to see you." Margaret turned her head, and when her eyes landed on him, she stopped breathing. Her hand flew up to her chest. Jonathan, his name just escaped her lips, like a memory she'd buried a long time ago. Jonathan didn't say a word. He stumbled a little in the doorway, reaching out to grab the doorframe to steady himself. Margaret's voice cracked. "I thought I'd never see you again." Rachel looked back and forth between them, her heart pounding in her chest. You know him?" Silence hung in the air. Then Margaret nodded, barely moving her head. Her lips trembled as she turned to Rachel. "He's your father." For a split second, nobody even breathed. The room felt like it was closing in, the walls getting smaller. The heater clicked on real quiet. A clock ticked on the shelf. But all Rachel could hear was her heart pounding in her ears. She looked at her mom, then at the guy standing in their living room, barely through the door, looking like he'd been hit by a truck. "You're what?" she asked, her voice sharp as glass. "My what?" Margaret tried to sit up a little, grabbing onto the blanket. "I was pregnant when he left," she said, sounding weak. "I never told him." Rachel stumbled back a step. She looked at Jonathan again, her eyes burning. "You didn't know?" Jonathan shook his head slowly, like the truth was still sinking in. "No, I didn't." Rachel's voice broke. "You're telling me. I've spent 24 years watching my mother struggle for every breath, while you were out there building empires. And you had no clue I even existed." Jonathan looked at Margaret. "You never told me." "Why?" Margaret's eyes filled up with tears. "Because your family didn't want me," she said. "They made that crystal clear. They told me to disappear, that I'd ruin your name, your future. I didn't want to be the woman who held you back from everything you were chasing." Rachel stepped back again, gasping for air. "So you let me grow up without a father? Without even knowing I had one? You let her do this all alone." Her voice wasn't yelling, but it was cutting. Margaret opened her mouth to say something, but no sound came out. Jonathan slowly moved to the arm of the couch, but he didn't sit down. His hands were shaking. "I would have stayed," he said softly, "if I'd known. I swear to you, I didn't walk away from you. I walked away from something I didn't even know was mine." Rachel just stared at him, crossing her arms over her chest like a shield. "You had everything," she said, the bitterness dripping from her voice. "While we had this." She gestured around the room, at the thin walls, the peeling paint, the pile of unpaid bills stacked on the counter. "You built a life while we were barely surviving. You went to fancy parties, I went to my second job." Tears were welling up in her eyes, but she blinked them away. Margaret whispered, "Rachel, please." But Rachel turned on her, the anger mixed with a whole lot of heartbreak. "You could have told me. You let me believe I wasn't wanted." Margaret's voice cracked. "I was trying to protect you from." Rachel cut her off. "From the truth." Jonathan finally spoke again, his voice almost too quiet to hear. "I can't fix what I didn't know, but I want to be here now. If you'll let me." Rachel's face hardened. "I don't know you," she said, "and right now I don't want to." And with that, she turned and walked down the hall, the old floorboards creaking under her feet. The door to her room closed real quiet, and Jonathan was left standing there in the same silence he'd brought with him. "How does it read to you?" "Ready for the next part, whenever you are." Margaret didn't push. She just watched her daughter drift further inside herself, and wondered if keeping quiet all those years had been the biggest mistake of all. Rachel couldn't sleep a wink. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Jonathan's face. Not the made-up version she'd imagined as a kid, the faceless guy she used to wonder about. Nope, this was different. Now, he had a voice, a way about him, a whole life she knew nothing about. And still, she felt empty inside. Because for 24 years, it had been just the two of them, her and her mom. Nobody ever came looking for them. Nobody even bothered to check in. And now someone finally had, but way too late. She sat at the kitchen table one morning, staring at that ring again, her fingers tracing the curved design. That swirl had always just been some pattern. Until now. Now it was a memory she didn't have, a story nobody told her, a connection she hadn't asked for, but couldn't shake. She didn't tell Margaret she was crying in the bathroom every night, or that she still kept checking the door, hoping maybe he'd come back. Not to explain things, but just to show up, to stay, even if it was just for a minute. But he didn't. At least, not yet. Then, on a Friday afternoon, a black car pulled up outside the house. This time, no snowstorm, just gray skies and the sound of an engine going quiet. Rachel had the door open before he could even knock. Jonathan Pierce was standing on the porch again, but something about him was different. Less put together, less guarded. More like a real person. Rachel didn't say a word. He held up a hand. "I'm not here to talk about the past," he said. "I just want to show you something." She crossed her arms. "You think showing up again is going to change what happened?" "No," he said, "but it might change what happens next." She didn't budge. "I won't stay long," he added. "Just give me 5 minutes." From inside, Margaret called out real weak from the couch. "Let him in, Rachel." Rachel hesitated, then stepped aside, letting him pass. Jonathan walked inside slow. His fancy shoes clicked against the warped hardwood floors, sticking out like a sore thumb among the beat-up rugs and thrift store furniture. But he didn't even seem to notice. He wasn't looking at the room, anyway. He was looking at Margaret. She was propped up on the couch, wrapped in a crocheted blanket, her face pale but alert. Her eyes never left him. Jonathan went over to her and knelt down. Not like some billionaire, but like a regular guy with something important to say that all the money in the world couldn't buy. "I've spent the last few days looking into everything," he said real gentle. "Into you, into Rachel, into what I missed." Margaret looked down, her fingers shaking in her lap. "I never wanted you to find out this way," she whispered. "I didn't deserve to find out at all," Jonathan said. "Not after the way I left things with you. But that's not why I'm here." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, worn, and folded. A photo. He held it out with both hands. "How's that sounding? Ready for more whenever you are." Laughing at something just out of view. Jonathan's arm was around her shoulders, and Margaret's smile was wide open, no holding back. And right there on her finger, plain as day, was the ring. Rachel felt her breath catch in her throat. She'd never seen her mom smile like that before. "I kept this," Jonathan said real quiet, "all these years. I didn't know why, I just did." Margaret took the photo, her hands shaking. Her lips moved, but no words came out. Jonathan turned to Rachel now. "I know I can't undo anything," he said, "but I'm not walking away again." He reached into his other pocket and put a folded envelope on the table. "I've cleared all the medical debt," he said, simple as could be. "Every single penny. And I've set things up for your mother to get the best cancer care in Boston. Best doctors in the country. Private transportation, immediate admission. It's all covered. No cameras, no press. Just treatment." Rachel stared at the envelope. "You think paying our bills makes this right?" "No," Jonathan replied. "It doesn't." He looked at her, not flinching. "But I can't turn back the clock. All I can do is show up now. You don't owe me anything. I'm not asking for a relationship. I'm just showing you that I'm here." Margaret reached out real slow then and took his hand. "I forgive you," she said, tears rolling down her face. Rachel just stood there, quiet as can be, her throat tight, her heart pounding so loud she could barely think. She wanted to yell, to ask why now, to ask where he'd been when she needed someone, anyone to lean on. But she also wanted to believe him. Just once. She looked at the photo again, and for the first time in her life, she saw proof that love had actually existed. Before all the quiet, before the hard times. She sank into the chair across from them and whispered, "I don't know you." Jonathan nodded, his voice barely there. "But I want you to." The photo stayed on the table long after Jonathan left. Rachel didn't touch it. She just sat across from it for hours. It felt like staring at those two younger faces caught in a laugh. Two hands tangled together. Two people who had once believed in something. Her mom had fallen asleep in the living room, breathing peaceful and steady, a rhythm Rachel hadn't heard in months. The envelope with the paid bills sat unopened next to the ring. It wasn't even about the money anymore. It was about the silence, the years, the guy who wasn't there. But something felt different now. Jonathan hadn't begged or tried to justify what he'd done. He'd just showed up, then stepped back when he saw she wasn't ready. That mattered. Later that week, a van showed up, private, no questions asked. Jonathan had done what he said he would, real quiet, no big show. Margaret's trip to Boston went smooth as could be, and the doctors were waiting for her, treating her like she was someone important. Not some charity case or some forgotten lady, but a patient with people who cared about her. Rachel stayed right by her, side the whole time. That night, all alone in the hospital waiting room, Rachel pulled the silver ring out of her pocket and turned it over slow in her hand. That swirl wasn't just a design anymore. It was like a line connecting them all. A choice. Maple Hollow. The snowbanks started shrinking, and the bare trees stretched up towards the sun. And for the first time in years, the house on the edge of town didn't feel like some place Rachel had to escape from. It felt like a place that had made it through. Margaret's health had leveled out. The care she was getting up in Boston, private, classy, and top-notch, was really helping. She had more get up and go now, and she was smiling again. Even her laugh had come back, a little quieter, but just as real. And even though she never said it out loud, Rachel knew what had made the difference. Jonathan hadn't just paid the bills and disappeared. He'd stuck around in the background, real quiet, real respectful. No big news stories, no fancy gifts, just steady, silent support. He never pushed, never tried to force his way into Rachel's life. He just made sure they had what they needed. And waited. One evening, Rachel drove out to Lake Waverly, where things got quiet enough to hear yourself think. She sat by the water's edge with a ring in her hand, holding it tight, and remembering all those nights she'd spent wishing she knew where she came from. Every birthday when there was nobody sitting next to her. Every question she never got to ask. And now she had a guy willing to answer them. A guy who had loved her mom once, and maybe still did. A guy who was powerful but humble. A guy who had come back. But you can't demand love from someone, and forgiveness isn't free. Rachel stared at the ring for a long time, then looked up at the sky, still not sure what to do next. So, what do you think Rachel should do now that the truth's finally out in the open? Should she open her heart to the father who showed up late to the game, or should she protect the life she built without him? Drop a comment and let me know what kind of ending you think fits Rachel's story best. Your thoughts really matter. If this story got to you, hit that subscribe button for more stories that'll stick with you long after they're over. And share it with someone who believes in healing, no matter how long it takes.